The emergency session of the Galactic Council assembled faster than any session in recent memory, and the great chamber filled with representatives from dozens of species, all wanting to see the recordings that Observer Vexthor had brought back from Sector 19. The displays showed the battle from multiple angles, showed human ships moving in formations that should not have worked but did work, showed tactics that violated traditional doctrine, but achieved results that traditional doctrine never could have achieved. Chairman Zormak stood at the center of the chamber watching the recordings with his crystalline form, shifting through colors that indicated confusion and surprise. And around him, the other council members whispered among themselves in their various languages, trying to process what they were seeing. Vexthor stood before the assembly, in his formal armor looking very different from the confident warrior who had been sent to document human failure 3 weeks ago. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the chamber with unusual gravity. He said that he had witnessed something unprecedented, that a species without genetic modification or neural linking or combat breeding had defeated a ravager swarm through nothing more than training and coordination and tactical innovation. He said that the humans fought with a sophistication that came from thousands of years of studying warfare against their own kind, that they had turned combat into both science and art, in ways that the galaxy had never considered. His words fell into a silence that felt heavy with implications, because if he was right, then everything the warrior species believed about military superiority was wrong. The council chamber erupted into discussion and debate, with some representatives insisting that one battle proved nothing, while others argued that the recordings showed clear evidence of capabilities that needed to be taken seriously. The Vryn counselor, who had mocked humanity's military potential, stood up with her scales flushed dark purple with what looked like embarrassment, and she said that perhaps the council had been hasty in dismissing human capabilities. Other voices joined hers, acknowledging that their previous assessment had been based on assumptions rather than evidence, that they had judged humans by standards that did not account for different approaches to warfare, that the galaxy might benefit from learning what humanity had to teach. Ambassador Vexthor continued his report, describing not just the battle, but what he had observed aboard the human ships afterward, the way they counted every loss and mourned every death, the way their commanders took personal responsibility for casualties, the way they studied and learned from every engagement. He said that human military culture was built around the concept that war was a terrible necessity, rather than a glorious calling, that their soldiers fought not because they were bred to fight, but because they chose to protect others, and that this fundamental difference in mindset produced warriors who were simultaneously more cautious and more effective than traditional warrior species. His words painted a picture of a species that understood violence in ways the galaxy had forgotten or never learned, a species that had weaponized adaptation itself through constant study and practice and refinement of doctrine. Chairman Zormak called for order, and the chamber fell silent again, and his voice resonated with the kind of formal authority that came from leading the council for decades. He said that the recordings were clear and undeniable, that humanity had demonstrated military capabilities that met or exceeded galactic standards, that the council had been wrong to dismiss them based on assumptions about what made effective warriors. He proposed formally recognizing the Terran Defense Force as a full military partner and inviting human strategists to join the council's defense planning committees. And his proposal met with widespread agreement from representatives who had watched the battle recordings and understood what they meant. Commander Jake Morrison and Lieutenant Sophie Grant stood before the council once more, and the atmosphere in the chamber had completely transformed from their last appearance. The dismissive humor was gone, replaced by careful attention and something approaching respect. And when Jake stepped forward to address the assembly, his voice was confident, but not arrogant. He said that humanity accepted the council's recognition with gratitude, but that recognition alone was not enough, that what the galaxy needed was cooperation and information sharing on a level that had never been attempted before. Sophie added that humans would share their military doctrine and tactical databases and strategic planning methods in exchange for intelligence on threats like the Ravagers and access to alien technologies and weapon systems that could enhance combined operations. The council members looked at each other with varying degrees of surprise because information sharing on this scale was unprecedented in galactic history, and several representatives raised concerns about sharing military secrets with a species they had only recently begun to take seriously. But Vexthor spoke up again and said that humans had already demonstrated trustworthiness by fighting alongside Council forces without asking for anything in return, that their willingness to share knowledge was itself evidence of good faith, and that the galaxy needed their expertise if the Ravager threat was going to be contained. His endorsement carried weight because he was respected as a military analyst, and because he had seen firsthand what humans could do, and slowly the Council began to agree that cooperation was worth the risk. Chairman Zormak asked Jake to explain how humans had learned to fight so effectively while still fighting among themselves, and the chamber fell silent, waiting for the answer to a question that had puzzled them all. Jake's expression turned somber, and he said that humans had never had the luxury of a common external enemy to unite them until they reached the stars, that every nation and culture and ideology on Earth had fought against others for resources and territory and beliefs. He said that this terrible history had taught humans everything about warfare, because they had been testing tactics against intelligent, adaptive opponents for thousands of years, opponents who could think and plan and counter whatever strategies were used against them. Sophie added that the cost of this education had been measured in billions of lives lost over millennia, that human history was written in blood and suffering, and that they had learned to be good at war, because the alternative was extinction at the hands of other humans. The Council members absorbed this information with visible discomfort because most species found internal warfare to be incomprehensible, and the Vryn counselor asked how humanity could be trusted if they still fought among themselves. Jake looked at her directly and said that humans had not fought a major war against each other in over 80 years, that reaching the stars had finally given them the common purpose that brought them together, but that the lessons learned from those old wars remained valuable. He said that understanding violence did not mean embracing it, that studying warfare did not mean loving war, and that the best peacekeepers were often those who understood exactly what peace was protecting people from. His words carried conviction that came from personal experience, from having studied history and served in combat and understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The formal vote to accept humanity as full military partners passed unanimously, and Chairman Zormak announced that joint training programs would begin immediately, with human instructors teaching alien warriors and alien instructors teaching human forces. The integration process would take months, but it would transform the Galactic Defense Force into something new, something that combined the genetic advantages of warrior species with the tactical sophistication of human doctrine. Jake and Sophie received the news with professional dignity, but Vexthor could see relief in their eyes, relief that humanity would finally be treated as equals rather than curiosities, relief that the sacrifices of the battle at Sector 19 had achieved their purpose. The months that followed saw changes ripple through galactic military culture as human instructors arrived at training facilities across Council space and began teaching their methods. Krillian warriors learned about combined arms tactics and how different unit types could support each other in ways their traditional doctrine had never considered. Vryn officers studied human strategic planning methods that emphasized flexibility and adaptation over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Species that had relied on genetic superiority learned that training and coordination could compensate for biological limitations, that thinking about combat in new ways could produce advantages that genetics alone could never provide. The humans in turn learned about shield technologies and exotic weapon systems and biological enhancements that opened new tactical possibilities, and the exchange of knowledge flowed in both directions, enriching everyone. Involved Captain Danny Hayes stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance looking at displays that showed a mixed fleet of human and alien vessels conducting joint training exercises, and beside him Commander Lisa Perry watched with satisfaction as Krillian destroyers executed a human tactical pattern with impressive precision. The aliens were learning quickly because they were professional warriors who understood the value of good training. The battle was over and the debris field stretched across thousands of kilometers of space, bits of destroyed Ravager bioships and pieces of human vessels tumbling in the silent vacuum, where moments before there had been fire and chaos and death. Captain Danny Hayes stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance and watched the tactical displays as his fleet regrouped, as rescue operations pulled damaged fighters back to the carriers, as repair ships moved toward the wounded destroyers that had taken the heaviest fire. His face was tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. the kind of weariness that came from knowing that victory had a price and that someone had to pay it. On one of his screens, a list was scrolling slowly past, names highlighted in red that meant they would not be coming home, and Danny read every single one because that was what commanders did when people died under their watch. Colonel Lisa Perry came onto the bridge still wearing her flight suit sealed tight from the combat, and she moved to Danny's side and looked at the same list he was looking at. She did not say anything at first because there was nothing to say that would make it better, nothing that would bring back the pilots who had flown their last mission, or the crew members who had gone down with their ships. Lisa had been flying combat missions for 15 years, and she knew the cost of war in a way that most people never understood. Knew it in the empty bunks and the unopened letters and the ceremonies, where they folded flags and played music and pretended that death in service was somehow noble rather than just final. Danny spoke quietly without taking his eyes off the list, and he said that 28 pilots were gone, that 3 destroyers had been destroyed with all hands, that 412 people would not be going home to their families. He said each number carefully as if the precision mattered, as if getting the count exactly right somehow honored the dead more than rounding to approximate figures. Lisa nodded and reported that all surviving pilots had been accounted for, that every escape pod had been recovered, that the rescue operations were complete, and everyone who could be saved had been saved. There was relief in her voice mixed with the grief, relief that the number was not higher, that more had not been lost, that the battle could have been so much worse than it was. The bridge crew worked quietly around them, coordinating the fleet's movements and compiling damage reports and sending status updates to Fleet Command back in human space. And there was none of the celebration that usually followed victory. The humans had won decisively, had destroyed a Ravager swarm that had been terrorizing the sector for months, had proved their capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt. But they were not cheering or congratulating themselves because winning was not the point. The point was doing what needed to be done and bringing as many people home as possible. And 412 failures to do that second part meant this was not a day for celebration, no matter how impressive the victory looked on tactical analysis. A transport beam deposited Observer Vexthor on the bridge without warning, and the Krillian warrior materialized in a shimmer of energy that made several crew members reach for weapons before they recognized him. He stood in his dark scales looking around the bridge with golden eyes that were wide with something like shock, and he moved toward Danny with the careful steps of someone who was not entirely sure what they were walking into. The captain turned to face him, and Vexthor saw something in the human's expression that made him stop, saw a depth of emotion that he had never associated with military commanders. In Krillian culture, warriors did not grieve for the fallen because death in combat was the highest honor, was the fulfillment of purpose for beings bred to fight. But Danny Hayes looked like someone who had just lost friends, and that loss hurt in ways that had nothing to do with honor or purpose. Vexthor said that the humans had achieved a decisive victory with minimal losses, that by any military standard in the galaxy, this battle should be recorded as a triumph and celebrated accordingly. He said it carefully as if he was trying to understand something that did not fit with his training, trying to process why a victorious commander would look so grief-stricken. Danny turned back to the screen with the list of names, and his voice was rough when he spoke. And he said that humans counted every loss because every single person mattered, because behind every name was a family and friends and a life that had been cut short. He said that they remembered the dead not as statistics but as individuals, that they wrote letters to families explaining how their loved ones had died, that they understood the cost of war in a way that went beyond tactical analysis and strategic planning. Colonel Lisa Perry looked at Vexthor, and her eyes were red from crying, though her voice was steady, and she told him that humans did not celebrate victory when people died to achieve it. She said that winning was necessary and important, but it was not glorious. That war was something humans did because they had to, not because they wanted to, that every battle they fought carried the weight of all the battles they had fought before. Vexthor listened and tried to understand this philosophy that seemed completely alien to everything he had been taught, tried to reconcile the efficient, deadly warriors he had watched fight with the grieving people standing before him now. Danny asked Vexthor if he wanted to understand humans, if he wanted to know what made them effective soldiers. And when the Krillian nodded, Danny took him on a tour of the ship. They walked through corridors where crew members were working to repair damage and tend to wounded and process the losses. And everywhere they went, Danny stopped to talk to people. He asked about their injuries and their conditions and their mental state, and he listened to their answers with complete attention, like each person was the most important thing in the universe at that moment. Vexthor watched and realized this was not just a captain checking on his crew. This was a human who genuinely cared about every individual under his command and felt personally responsible for their well-being. They visited the medical bay where the wounded were being treated, and Danny spoke to each injured crew member by name, asking about their condition and promising that they would get the best care available. One young pilot named Ensign Paul Rogers had ejected from his fighter after taking heavy damage, and his arm was broken and his face was bruised, but he was grinning because he had survived. Danny sat by his bed and they talked about the battle, and about the pilot's family back on Earth and about what would happen during recovery, and Vexthor saw the bond between them that went beyond rank or duty. These humans fought together not because genetics compelled them, but because they chose to protect each other, chose to stand beside people they cared about. And that choice made them more effective than any amount of breeding could have made them. Ensign Paul Rogers asked Danny about the overall battle results, and the captain told him they had won decisively, but at a cost. And the young pilot's grin faded as he asked about the losses. When Danny told him the numbers, Paul closed his eyes and said something that Vexthor did not expect. He named several of the dead pilots and said they had been in his training class, that they had graduated together and served together, and now they were gone. The sorrow in his voice was genuine and deep, and Vexthor realized that human military units were not just professional organizations, but families in a sense. Groups of people bound together by shared experience and mutual sacrifice, and the knowledge that they depended on each other for survival. They continued through the ship, and everywhere the pattern repeated. Crew members greeting their captain with respect and affection, conversations that went beyond professional necessity into genuine human connection. And slowly Vexthor began to understand something fundamental about the species he had dismissed as soft and unprepared for real warfare. The humans did not fight because they were bred to fight or because neural implants made them efficient killers. They fought because they cared about protecting people, and that care made them willing to face any danger. Every tactic they used and every weapon they deployed was in service of a simple goal, which was bringing their people home alive. And when they failed at that goal, they felt it personally in ways that warrior species never felt anything. Danny took Vexthor to the ship's archives where they stored records of human military history, and he pulled up files that showed battles and wars stretching back thousands of years. He showed the Krillian warrior how humans had studied every conflict, had analyzed every success and failure, had built entire institutions dedicated to understanding warfare so they could minimize casualties in future conflicts. He explained that human military academies did not just teach tactics and weapons. They taught history and ethics and psychology. They taught future officers to understand the human cost of every decision and to make choices that valued life even in the midst of trying to take life from enemies. Vexthor asked why humans bothered with such things when war was ultimately about killing enemies and breaking their will to fight. And Danny looked at him with something like pity in his eyes. He said that if war was only about killing, then humans would be the best at it because they had practiced on each other for millennia, but that being good at killing was not the same as being good at war. Observer Vexthor sat in his cloaked reconnaissance ship, watching the human fleet prepare for battle, and his golden eyes tracked every movement on the tactical displays with the attention of someone who had studied warfare for longer than most species had been spacefaring. The Council had sent him here to document the humans' failure, to record the inevitable destruction of their forces, so that the younger species would understand their place in the galactic order. But what he was seeing on his screens made no sense according to everything he had learned in 40 years of military service. The human vessels were spreading out across a massive volume of space with no apparent coordination, breaking every rule of fleet tactics that the Krillian Empire had perfected over millennia, and for a moment he thought perhaps the Council had been right to dismiss them as amateurs playing at. Then the Ravager swarm hit the dispersed human formation, and Vexthor realized he was not watching amateur mistakes. He was watching something entirely new. The bioships dove into the scattered fleet like predators pursuing fleeing prey, exactly as they had done in dozens of battles that Vexthor had studied. But this time the prey had teeth, and those teeth were closing around the predators from every direction. The human ships lit up with weapons fire that came from angles the Ravagers could not have anticipated. creating a web of destruction that the enemy flew into before they understood the trap. Vexthor leaned forward in his seat, his scales shifting color with excitement as he began to understand what he was witnessing. The humans were using their smaller ship size not as a weakness, but as a tactical advantage, trading the heavy armor and massive weapons of traditional warships for speed and maneuverability that let them control the engagement. Every vessel was positioned to support multiple others, creating overlapping fields of fire that meant any Ravager attacking one ship would be hit by 2 or 3 others simultaneously. It was a doctrine that required perfect coordination and constant communication, and Vexthor could hear the human channels buzzing with rapid exchanges as officers and pilots shared information and adjusted their positions in real time. They were not fighting as individual ships that happened to be in the same fleet. They were fighting as a single integrated system, where every part knew what every other part was doing. Lieutenant Ben Carter commanded a squadron of destroyers that were executing something he called Pattern Delta 7, and Vexthor had his science officer pull up the tactical analysis of what that pattern actually meant. The destroyers were moving in a rotation where one would bait the Ravagers into pursuing, while the others swung around to hit the pursuers from the sides and rear. Then the roles would switch and another destroyer would become the bait. It was simple in concept but devastating in execution, because the Ravagers kept falling for it, their instincts driving them to chase individual targets without recognizing the larger pattern. Vexthor realized he was watching a tactic that could only work if every pilot and every captain understood not just their own role, but the roles of everyone around them. And that level of coordination suggested training that went far beyond what he had imagined possible. The massive human carrier UNS Ranger was launching fighters in wave after wave, and these small craft moved through space in ways that made Vexthor's tactical displays show impossible acceleration curves. Commander Kate Sullivan was directing the fighter wings, her voice steady and calm as she called out targets and vectors and attack patterns using abbreviations that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant everything to her pilots. The fighters pulled maneuvers that should have rendered their pilots unconscious or dead, twisting through 3-dimensional space with acceleration forces that Vexthor's computer calculated at levels far beyond what unmodified biology could withstand. His science officer ran scans on the fighter craft trying to understand how the humans were surviving, and the results showed some kind of gel suspension system that cushioned the pilots, plus chemical enhancers that let them maintain consciousness and reaction speed under extreme stress. Thor had been bred for combat. His entire genetic line had been selected over generations for traits that made superior warriors, and he had neural implants that let him interface directly with weapon systems and tactical computers. Every Krillian warrior had these advantages built into their bodies from birth, and it was one of the reasons his species had dominated galactic military affairs for so long. But watching the human fighters dance through space, he realized that genetic modification and neural linking were only one path to creating effective warriors, and perhaps not even the best path. The humans had achieved through training and technology what his people achieved through biology, and they had done it in a way that was more flexible and adaptable, because they could change their tactics without waiting for genetics to catch up. A human pilot named Lieutenant Amy Brooks called out over the channels that she had 6 Ravagers pursuing her and was coming around for another attack run. And before Vexthor could process what was happening, another pilot named Captain Ryan Foster was already responding. The 2 fighters moved in perfect synchronization, executing a complex maneuver where Amy led the Ravagers into a turn, while Ryan came at them from an angle they could not see, and the pursuing bioships found themselves in a crossfire they could not escape. It happened in seconds, faster than Vexthor could follow on his displays, and he realized these pilots had done this maneuver before. They had practiced it over and over until it was muscle memory and instinct, until they could execute it while under fire and stressed and surrounded by enemies trying to kill them. That was when understanding hit Vexthor like a physical blow, and he turned to his science officer with scales rippling in colors that indicated shock and revelation. He said that the humans had been fighting each other, that they had spent thousands of years developing tactics and counter-tactics in wars against opponents who could think and adapt and learn, and that experience had prepared them for anything the galaxy could throw at them. His science officer pulled up the human historical database that was part of their cultural exchange with the Council, and together they scrolled through thousands of years of warfare documented in excruciating detail. Battles and campaigns and wars that spanned continents and oceans and eventually worlds. Conflicts where humans fought humans with increasing sophistication and lethality. Each war teaching lessons that were studied and analyzed and incorporated into doctrine for the next war. The warrior species of the galaxy had evolved past internal conflict before reaching the stars, had found peace within their own kind through biology or culture or simple exhaustion, and their military doctrines reflected that peaceful past. They fought external threats using strategies developed against enemies that were fundamentally different from themselves, against species with different biology and different thinking and different capabilities. But humans had developed their strategies fighting themselves, fighting enemies who were exactly as smart and exactly as adaptable and exactly as dangerous as they were. Every tactic had a counter-tactic. Every strategy had been tested against opponents who could predict and adapt. Every doctrine had been refined through centuries of trial and error against the most dangerous enemy humanity had ever faced, which was humanity itself. Vexthor watched the battle unfold on his displays with new understanding, seeing patterns he had missed before. The humans never repeated the same attack approach twice in a row. They constantly varied their tactics to prevent the Ravagers from adapting, and this flexibility came from having studied every possible variation in their own conflicts. When a group of Ravagers tried a new attack pattern, the humans adjusted immediately, shifting their formation and weapons fire in response, and this adaptability came from experience fighting opponents who also adjusted and adapted. The bioships were deadly and numerous and driven by instinct refined over millennia of evolution. But they were not creative and they could not think strategically the way humans could think strategically, because thinking strategically required fighting opponents who thought strategically. A flight of human bombers moved through the battle space escorted by fighters that wove defensive patterns around them like protective shields. And Vexthor recognized the formation as something called a combat box that humans had developed hundreds of years ago in atmospheric warfare. They had taken a tactic designed for fighting in gravity wells and adapted it for space combat, had tested it in simulations and exercises against their own forces until they knew every strength and weakness, and now they were using it against an enemy that had no defense against it, because the Ravagers had never encountered anything like it before. The bombers released their payloads into clusters of Ravager bioships, and the explosions tore through the living vessels with devastating efficiency, and the whole time the escort fighters kept any threats from getting close enough to stop the attack. Lieutenant Ben Carter's destroyer squadron was demonstrating another principle that Vexthor recognized from his studies of military theory, something the humans called combined arms, where different types of units worked together to create effects that none could achieve alone. The monitoring station at Sector 19 hung in space like a metal flower, with sensor arrays spreading out in all directions. And inside the main command center, Station Commander Ixavilla watched her displays with the calm attention of someone who had been doing this job for 20 years. She was from a species that lived mostly in water on their homeworld, and her body was adapted for both liquid and air, with membranes that shifted when she breathed and skin that shimmered with moisture under the artificial lights. Her species had never been warriors, but they made excellent observers and analysts, which was why they ran most of the monitoring stations along the border territories where the Ravagers were most active. Beside her stood her deputy Torax, who was young for a Krillian and still learning the systems, and he was the one who first noticed the unusual readings coming from the jump point at the edge of the sector. Torax called out that something was coming through, that the sensors were picking up massive energy signatures consistent with fleet-scale jump drives, and Ixavilla turned her attention to the displays with interest because they were not expecting any military vessels in this sector today. The Council had mentioned something about a human ship being sent to patrol the area, a single vessel that would likely be destroyed quickly once the Ravagers showed up. But these readings suggested something much larger than a single ship. The displays began populating with contact markers as ships emerged from jump space, and Ixavilla felt her membranes flutter with confusion as the numbers kept climbing. One ship, then 5, then 10, then 20. And still they came through the jump point in precise formation like beads on a string. She ordered Torax to recalibrate the sensors because the readings had to be wrong, had to be some kind of glitch or interference. But the young Krillian ran the diagnostics twice and confirmed that everything was functioning perfectly. The humans had not sent a single ship as agreed. They had sent an entire battle group consisting of 12 capital ships that the sensors classified as carriers and battleships and cruisers, 46 support vessels including destroyers and frigates and supply ships, and hundreds of smaller craft that were still emerging from the hangar bays of the larger vessels. They were arranged in formations that Ixavila did not recognize from any military doctrine in the galactic database. Formations that seemed to make no tactical sense, with ships spread out at irregular intervals and different vessel types, mixed together in ways that violated standard fleet organization. The flagship of the human fleet sent a communication request and Ixavila accepted it, and the view screen showed a human male with gray hair at his temples, and a face marked with old scars that spoke of long service in combat zones. He identified himself as Captain Danny Hayes of the UNS Defiance, and he said that Terran Battle Group 7 was reporting as ordered and ready to engage the Ravager threat. His voice was casual and confident, like he was discussing the weather, rather than preparing for combat against an enemy that had destroyed 17 battle fleets. And Ixavila felt a surge of panic because this was not what was supposed to happen. The Council had authorized one ship, one small demonstration that would prove humans were not ready for military operations, and instead an entire armada had shown up uninvited and unauthorized. Ixavila told Captain Hayes that he was supposed to send only one vessel for evaluation, that bringing an entire fleet was not part of the agreement, and she could hear her own voice rising in pitch the way it did when she was stressed. The human just smiled at her through the view screen, and it was not a polite diplomatic smile, but rather something harder and more determined. He said that humans did not do anything halfway, that when they committed to something they committed fully, and that if the Council wanted to see what humanity could do in combat, then they would get a proper demonstration. He asked where the Ravagers were most active and where his fleet should deploy, and his tone suggested that he was not asking for permission, but simply for tactical information. Before Ixavila could formulate a response, the station alarms began shrieking through every corridor and every room, and the displays lit up with red warning markers as sensors detected a massive Ravager swarm emerging from deep space. 300 bioships appeared on the scopes, each one a living creature the size of a cruiser that had been bred and modified for war in ways that made even the Krillian genetic modifications look primitive. The Ravagers were not a civilization in any sense that the galaxy understood. They were more like a plague or an infestation, creatures that consumed and reproduced and spread without any apparent goal beyond growth and expansion. They had been pushing into Council space for 5 years now, and every attempt to stop them had failed, because they adapted too quickly and bred too fast and fought with a savagery that even warrior species found difficult to match. Torax was already initiating the evacuation protocols because standard procedure was to abandon monitoring stations when Ravager swarms this large appeared, and Ixavila began sending emergency signals to the nearest military bases, even though she knew no help would arrive in time. She turned to the view screen where Captain Hayes was watching his own displays, and she told him that he should retreat immediately, that this force was too large for any fleet to handle, that his ships would be torn apart if they stayed. The human looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something that made her stop talking. It was not fear or panic or even the grim resignation of someone facing certain death. It was calculation mixed with anticipation, the look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Danny turned away from the screen and began issuing orders to his fleet, and Ixavila could hear him speaking to someone called Colonel Lisa Perry about launching all fighters and telling someone called Admiral to bring the fleet to battle stations. The human vessels began moving into new formations, and their movement was smooth and coordinated like they had practiced these maneuvers 1,000 times. The Ravager swarm was approaching fast, their bioships pulsing with the bioluminescent patterns they used for communication, and Ixavila watched on her displays as the two forces moved toward contact. She had seen this scenario play out dozens of times before, had watched battle fleets get torn apart by Ravager swarms, and she began recording everything because at least the Council would have documentation of what happened to the human fleet. But what happened next was nothing like what she expected, nothing like any battle she had witnessed in 20 years of monitoring combat operations. The human fleet did not form up into the standard defensive sphere that most species used, did not create the wall formation that the Krillians favored, did not even attempt the scattered defense pattern that some of the more mobile species employed. Instead, they did something that looked completely insane. They spread out across a huge volume of space with individual ships moving in seemingly random directions. For a moment, Ixavilla thought they were routing before the battle even began. Thought they were breaking formation and fleeing in panic. But then she realized that every ship was moving according to some plan that she could not understand. The Ravagers reacted the way they always reacted when they saw prey species fleeing. They accelerated and dove into the scattered human formation, like predators chasing frightened animals. They moved with terrifying speed for creatures so large, their bioships undulating through space with powerful contractions of muscle and membrane, and Ixavilla whispered a prayer for the humans in their language because she knew what came next. The Ravagers would swarm over the scattered ships and tear them apart with bioweapons that dissolved armor and claws that could rip through hulls, and the battle would be over in minutes. But the humans had not scattered in panic, they had scattered into a trap. And when the Ravagers were fully committed to their attack, the trap closed around them. The human ships revealed their true nature all at once, lighting up with weapons fire that came from directions the Ravagers had not expected. Every vessel was a platform covered in armaments that operated on principles Ixavilla had never seen before. Guns that fired solid projectiles accelerated to incredible speeds, missiles that carried explosive warheads, energy beams that cut through biomatter, and stranger weapons that seemed to disrupt the Ravagers' biological functions. The aliens in the monitoring station watched in shock as the space between the fleets became a web of crossfire, with human ships supporting each other from multiple angles. Human officer named Lieutenant Ben Carter was coordinating a squadron of destroyers, and Ixavilla could hear his voice over the open channels as he gave orders in rapid-fire bursts using codes and abbreviations that meant nothing to her, but apparently meant everything to his ships. He called for something called Pattern Delta 7, and the destroyers moved in perfect synchronization to create overlapping fields of fire that shredded Ravager bioships. The human vessels were smaller than the galactic standard for military craft, and Ixavilla had assumed this meant they were weaker or less capable. But now she understood that the size was deliberate. The smaller ships were faster and more maneuverable. They could dodge and weave through space in ways that larger vessels could not match. The great council chamber stretched out like a cathedral made of light and crystal, and in the center of it all stood Commander Jake Morrison in his blue uniform with silver buttons that caught the strange alien lighting and threw it back in sharp little flashes. He had been standing there for what felt like hours, while the council members talked among themselves in their clicking and humming languages, and beside him, Lieutenant Sophie Grant stood perfectly still with her hands clasped behind her back the way they had been taught at the academy. The chamber was filled with beings from across the galaxy, some tall as trees and others small as children, some made of what looked like living crystal, and others covered in scales or fur or skin in colors that Earth had never seen. Jake had studied them all before coming here, had memorized their names and their species and their customs, but standing before them now made him feel very small and very young even though he was 35 years old and had served in the Terran Defense Force for 15 years. The chairman of the council was a being called Zormak, and he was made entirely of some kind of crystalline structure that shifted colors when he moved. And when he finally turned his attention back to the two humans, his voice came out like wind chimes being struck by a gentle breeze. He spoke in the common galactic language that Jake had learned through neural implants, and every word felt like a dismissal even before the actual meaning registered in his brain. The chairman said that the council appreciated humanity's enthusiasm to join the fight against the Ravagers, those terrible beings that had been destroying colony worlds and battle fleets for years now. But that warfare was not something that could be done by merchant species and explorers. He said it kindly enough, the way you might tell a child that they cannot help with adult work. And Jake felt his jaw tighten even as he forced himself to remain calm and professional. Sophie shifted slightly beside him, and Jake knew without looking that she was angry too, that she was keeping her face neutral the same way he was keeping his neutral, because they had both known this would happen. For 3 years now, humanity had been part of the Galactic Council, had sent their trading ships and their exploration vessels and their diplomats to dozens of worlds, and in all that time not a single alien species had taken them seriously as warriors. The Council saw humans as useful traders and curious explorers, as beings who could fix things and invent things and talk their way through problems, but not as fighters. Not as soldiers. Not as people who understood war the way the warrior races understood war. A being called Vexthor leaned forward in his seat, and he was from the Krillian Empire, which had dominated military affairs in the galaxy for longer than humans had been walking upright on Earth. He was tall and covered in dark scales that reflected light like oil on water, and his eyes were golden and slitted like a cat's eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was deep and amused in a way that made Jake's hands curl into fists behind his back. Vexthor said that humans had shown the Council their warships, and that they were adequate perhaps for defending a single star system, but nothing more. He said that true warrior species had genetic modifications that made them stronger and faster, and more resilient than baseline biology could ever achieve. He said that warrior species had neural links that connected them directly to their ships and weapons. He said that warrior species were bred for combat the way farmers bred crops for yield, selecting the best traits over generations until war was in their very blood and bones. Sophie took a step forward then, and her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it like a blade wrapped in silk. She said that humans did not need to be bred for war, that humans had been practicing war on themselves for thousands of years before they ever reached the stars, and the chamber fell silent at that. The translator devices struggled with the concept for a moment, because most species in the galaxy had evolved past internal conflict before they developed spaceflight. War between members of the same species was considered primitive and barbaric, a thing that marked a civilization as dangerous or unstable or both. But Sophie stood there with her chin up and her eyes bright, and she did not take back her words or apologize for them. The council members whispered among themselves in their various languages, and Jake could see confusion and something like disgust rippling through the assembly. A being covered in purple scales that shifted color with her emotions spoke up, and her name was something that Jake's implant translated as High Counselor of the Vryn Unity. She said that internal warfare was a sign of a broken species, that healthy civilizations found peace within themselves before reaching outward, and that perhaps humanity was not ready for the responsibilities of galactic citizenship if they still fought among their own kind. Her scales had gone dark purple with what Jake recognized as condescension, and he had to bite his tongue to keep from saying something that would make the situation worse. Vexthor drummed his talons on the armrest of his seat, and the sound echoed through the chamber like distant thunder. He said that the Council would grant humanity one chance to prove themselves, that they could send a single warship to the Outer Rim, where the Ravagers were most active, and if that ship survived an encounter with the enemy, then perhaps the Council would reconsider their position. It was said generously, but Jake heard the trap in it, heard the expectation of failure, heard the dismissal wrapped up in false opportunity. The Outer Rim was where 17 battle fleets had been destroyed in the last year alone, where entire armadas of warrior species, with all their genetic modifications and neural links and combat breeding, had been torn apart by the Ravager swarms. Jake looked at Sophie and saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes, saw the understanding that they were being sent to die as an object lesson, as proof that soft species should stay in their soft roles and leave the fighting to those who were made for it. But he also saw determination there, saw the same fire that had carried them both through academy training and combat simulations, and the long years of preparation for this moment. Humanity had been waiting for a chance to show what they could do, and if this was the only chance they would get, then they would take it and make it count. He turned back to the Council and stood straighter, and his voice carried across the chamber clear and strong. He said that humanity accepted the challenge, that they would send their forces to the Outer Rim and engage the Ravagers, and that the Council would see exactly what humans were capable of when pushed to fight. There was no hesitation in his words and no fear, only certainty and something that might have been anticipation. Sophie stood beside him and echoed his acceptance, and together they saluted the Council in the military fashion of Earth, with right hands rising to foreheads in a sharp, precise motion that was older than spaceflight and older than most of the species in the chamber. Zor, Mac's crystalline form, shifted through several colors before settling on something that looked like acceptance mixed with pity, and he formally dismissed the human delegation with words about hoping for their safe return. As Jake and Sophie turned to leave the chamber, they could hear the Council members already talking among themselves, already discussing how quickly they expected the human ship to be destroyed, and whether it was worth sending a rescue mission afterward. The doors sealed behind them with a soft hiss, and only then did Jake let out the breath he had been holding. Sophie looked at him and smiled, and it was not a happy smile, but rather the kind of smile soldiers share before a battle. They might not survive. They walked through the corridors of the council, stationed toward the docking bay where their shuttle waited, and neither of them spoke until they were sealed inside and heading back toward the human embassy ship. Then Sophie laughed, and it was a sharp, bitter sound that filled the small cabin. She said that the council had just made the biggest mistake of their very long lives, and Jake nodded because he was thinking the same thing. The aliens thought they knew what war was, thought they understood combat because they had bred themselves into warriors and linked themselves to machines and fought their enemies with superior genetics. But they had never fought someone like themselves, had never tested their doctrines against an enemy that could think and adapt and change tactics in the middle of battle. Humans had fought humans for millennia, had studied every battle and every war and every conflict in their long bloody history. They had academies dedicated to understanding warfare, libraries filled with tactical manuals and strategic analyses, simulation centers that could recreate any battle ever fought. They had learned from every mistake and refined every success, had turned the art of killing into a science and the science of war into something approaching philosophy. And now they would show the galaxy what that meant, would demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous warriors were not the ones bred for combat, but the ones who chose it and studied it and practiced it until they could fight in their sleep. The shuttle docked with the embassy ship, and Jake immediately called an emergency meeting with the senior staff. And within minutes the conference room was filled with officers and specialists all waiting to hear what the council had decided.